Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery preparing to check in on a couple systems. These bins have African nightcrawlers living in them. ANC is my abbreviation for African nightcrawler. And these are my oldest active systems at the present time. These systems were last checked in on 12 days ago. And at that time we were thinking that we would just go about our normal feeding routine and just feed them like we would normally do, and we did feed them. However, we deviated from what my normal feeding approach would have been, which would have been just to place the food for them down the middle, and we opted to relocate the feeding zone. As you can see from my feeding zone indicator, which is just this coffee filter over here on the edge of the bin, the feeding zone was relocated to that edge closer to you, the camera, the viewer. And the whole idea behind that was that when my systems get to the point where they're nearing their end and I want to get them ready for harvest, I try to get the worms to gather in a particular spot in the system so that they effectively leave their worm castings behind in pursuit of the foods that I'm giving them. So that was the whole idea of doing this sort of edge feeding rather than the typical down the middle style feeding that I would normally do. And in effect, we've, I guess, reclassified these systems as no longer actively composting, but rather being in the mode of horizontal migration. That's the way I've reclassified them. And in time, they'll evacuate their old castings and congregate on the edge of the bin where the food gets placed regularly. So I was going to follow suit with what we did here 12 days ago and put more food in on that far edge away from me. You could see the stuff that they got last time consisted of some tomato because some of the seeds of the tomato are sprouting over here, and they're going to get more tomato. The stuff that I pulled out of my garden is still sitting here in a box. Some of it ripe, some of it is ready to be eaten, some of it just ends up, turning out to be not so good or starts into the decomposition process. And gradually I just start disqualifying things as being potentially human food and gather up those not so nice looking tomatoes from my collection from my garden and sort of reclassify them as stuff for the wormies. So we took all this nice leafy matter. There's still some of it floating around here on the edges. Last time the whole top of the system still had some leftover top dressing leafy matter that we collected up, and that actually became the foundation for the feeding last time. So we dug a hole over here on the far edge, dropped in all the leaves that we collected, in went the food. So you know what, before we venture over into the feeding area and give them today's portion to continue the migration, I just thought we might explore the rest of the system really quickly, and perhaps along the way we can even attempt to gather up some larger bits of stuff that should really be over in the feeding area so that it gets the full attention of the worms. I started to get this weird feeling after I viewed the video from last time that perhaps these finished castings were not quite as finished as I had hoped that they would have been, and that there was still a good bit of residual material floating around within the stuff. So I really thought that perhaps we could do a little bit of a reconnaissance mission during today's check-in to see if we can collect up any other larger bits of food scraps or bedding bits or whatever we might encounter along the way. And the other thing I think that I sort of failed to do last time, and I think this is already signs of it, we sort of dug into the edge, we dug into this edge too, but we never even dug down the middle. And down the middle is where, as I mentioned earlier, has always been the spot where I typically feed the bins. So we didn't even really, I don't think, examine the state of how the previous feeding had progressed. We just went straight into feeding these little guys and never even checked in on how the feeding from the previous check-in had done. And I mean, over the course of 2 feeding intervals now, you would think that there'd be virtually no leftovers down the middle from 2 feedings ago. But I do feel like I'm still bumping into at least leaves, you know, good chunks of leaves that were part of that last feeding. And here and there I'm also seeing a larger bit of something, which is probably a little bit of corn cob. I guess it does sort of make good sense to try to blend in any of that stuff that's really stagnating here, so that hopefully it's got a little bit better chance at also getting broken down like the rest of the stuff in the bin. Anything larger can just get collected up and thrown over to the edge so that it can get incorporated into our feeding today. So yeah, that was kind of a weird check-in last time. I sort of switched gears midway through the check-in. Rather than just making it a routine down the middle feeding like I normally would do in most of my active everyday bins, we sort of made the decision to start gearing these little guys up for migration out of their castings. And it wasn't really thought out thoroughly, and since it was sort of a last minute, you know, alteration to what I had come down here originally to do, which was just to give them food, we inadvertently, not inadvertently, but I don't know, perhaps a little, what's the right word, prematurely initiated the migration of the worms out of their castings. Almost makes me wonder how this is going to turn out, or how long it's going to actually take for the worms to really polish off all the residual bits of stuff that's still out here, and the stuff that would typically be very, very close to being castings only before I would initiate the migration of the worms out of the material. And then as we start to draw all the worms over into that far edge of the bin to get collected up and relocated, you know, as they mob towards the fresh supply of foods, they're just sort of abandoning this edge of the bin where there's still a good bit of work to be done. Kind of makes me second guess whether we made the right move, you know. Not to mention the fact that there's all kinds of leaf stems. You know, the use of leaves as bedding up until, I guess even, not last time, but yeah, as recently as 2 check-ins ago, brought with it all those leaf stems, which just by their nature require a good bit more time to break down. So, I don't know, I just kind of had this weird kind of cloud over my head, continuing to go back and thinking about this system in terms of whether we did the right thing, reclassifying it as being in migration mode now, and whether the material that they're migrating out of is in fact finished castings, or is it just half-baked with all this residue still in it. Almost makes me want to kind of just go back to treating this as an everyday worm bin, possibly even putting the feeding zone back down in the middle to keep worm traffic kind of evenly distributed throughout the bin, rather than focusing them onto this far edge of the bin. So I don't know, I'm going to give this bin number 2 over here a similar assessment now. See if we can at the same time do what we just did over in bin number 1, which is also collect up larger chunks of this and that as we encounter them. Little bits of corn cob, which I've typically been trying to break up as I encounter it. All kinds of leaf stems, leafy matter debris. I wish I can get feedback from the viewers in real time on this, and then just make my next move based on input from the viewers, because the viewers, somehow I always feel like I can trust the input I get from my viewers. People that are just here to, you know, observe and learn, because perhaps they're new to the game, will typically not try to steer me in one direction or another, but people that have been doing this for some time can often provide me with some pretty valuable input on what I'm doing good and what I'm doing not so good. And I am definitely starting to get this feeling like perhaps we can just sort of undo what we did last time in terms of classification of the system, and perhaps just continue treating it as a just an ongoing, you know, system. And let them work down all this stuff that they're still in need to, I don't know, needing to polish off. I don't like it when I get into this weird kind of on the fence and can't seem to make my mind up on what to do next. Oh, look at this. There must be some leftovers over here because these little guys are mobbed all over this one section of the bin. It must be the leaves. Because any sort of kitchen scraps that would have been put in there 2 feedings ago must have been long gone by now. But if there was still a big mound of leaves, then these African nightcrawlers would very likely be all over that because they do love their bedding. So, yeah, I think I'm starting to get this feeling like maybe we'll take a peek at how they did on the last feeding that was placed over on that edge, and maybe we'll just go back to classifying today's check-in as just another everyday feeding. Position it down the middle, and I'll kind of undo what I did in my tracking spreadsheet, which is reclassifying this system as being in migration mode now, and just treat everything they've gotten up until now, including that edge feeding last time, as just another feeding. Why don't we do that? And by all means, if you're, you know, in a position to provide me with some feedback on this line of thinking, I'd love to hear people's thoughts on it. But I'm sure most people will have to agree that, you know, just by looking at this stuff, you can tell that there's still work to be done in here, and quite a bit of it, just based on what we're seeing here today. I think I just kind of got the wrong impression about how far along the system actually was last time, and I think it was mainly because we never even looked down the middle of the bin where all of the new stuff always used to get added over the course of many feedings over time, and that's where we're going to find the truth in terms of how much work still needs to be done in the system to really get everything polished off. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to restore our feeding zone to the middle, and these little chunks of corn cob, I just can't seem to resist breaking them up. Part of what they're getting today includes a couple days worth of coffee, and that includes the coffee filter. So we'll add the coffee filters that were serving that function of feeding zone indicator up until now to the feeding zone as supplementary bedding, but I don't think we're going to add any more bedding at this point. We're just going to let them continue working on the stuff that's clearly still in here in abundant amounts, and then we'll take it from there. Let's not forget, I do want to also just see how things look over on that far edge where we started trying to steer them towards during the last check-in. So here's some of the stuff from my garden. You can see some of these tomatoes definitely have taken a turn for the worse and will definitely not be consumed as human food anymore. But it's right up the worm's alley. It's stuff that the worms are definitely going to appreciate getting. So let's plop in their portion for the day. And you know, I've still got quite a bit of this tomato remaining, gradually getting consumed as human food, gradually getting picked through to see if any of it has already kind of gotten to the point where we might not want to consider it as human food anymore. So let's get things buttoned up over here. And then I guess we'll level off a little bit, but we'll also use some of the material from the far end of the bin where they were last fed to cover up. So this stuff I'm sprinkling in is my worm chow. It's just a mix of different stuff. And a lot of it is pumpkin seed. A lot of it is also a new material that I've not yet used really for worm chow, which is some noodles that were made out of vegetable matter rather than being made out of flour. So I got a funny feeling that the worms are going to really appreciate this latest batch of worm chow. I'm wondering how things over here are looking. Here too, don't forget what we used as the foundation for this feeding over here was all the leafy matter that we had collected off the top surface. So this is yet more work for the worms to get done for us. So yeah, I definitely get that feeling now that starting into the migration of this system and trying to steer it towards harvest might have been a little bit premature. It almost makes me feel like we should have actually excavated all that leafy material that was down there and incorporated that down into the feeding zone too. Hindsight is always 20/20. But it's too late for that, I think. I think we're just going to have to deal with it. Perhaps blending in the stuff a little bit. And I almost forgot, since this was where we last fed, chances are that this is where we're going to encounter a good many of the worms that live in these systems. And that definitely seems to be the case. Good number of worms came out to feast on the stuff that they got last time. And the stuff they got last time was very similar to what they got now. You can even see some of the skins of some of the tomato that they were fed last time. And here too, a lot of the leaves that we collected off the top surface and used as the bedding foundation for the last feeding, which I've now tried to sort of declump, if that's the right way to think about it, sort of blend it in, homogenize things, and hopefully give all that stuff a slightly better chance at getting broken down. So I'm just going to come back in with some of this more clean material. I guess that'll help us also kind of cover up a lot of that excavated leafy matter that came out of the edge feeding zone from last time. Hopefully by being beneath the surface it'll retain its moisture. I mean, the plastic coverings we've got on here will help the material retain its moisture quite nicely as well. But I believe but I believe that by being beneath the surface, it'll also help it stay nice and moist so that the worms can really start working on it. And I think we're kind of done. We're going to have to just take it step by step at this point and really evaluate each check-in a little bit more carefully, I think, before we try to pull the trigger on anything like, you know, deeming the material as being so finished that we would want to proceed to migration of the worms out. And if we do what we did here today, which is really include no new bedding other than just reusing the old feeding zone indicator as a little tiny supplementary bedding in the feeding zone, then, you know, they'll have an opportunity to work down what remains in the bin. And hopefully they'll do it pretty quickly, because there's a pretty good sized population in both of these systems. Both of these systems seem quite capable. There's a good bit of moisture, I can tell, which also aids in the breakdown of the materials in their system. And yeah, they'll get a little bit distracted from working down the residual stuff by getting fresh foods, but hopefully in short order we'll start to see the entire contents of these systems really mature to the point where we do feel like they really are ready for migration. So I'm definitely curious to see what kind of reactions I'm going to get in the comments. If you have any ideas or feedback on what I'm doing here, hopefully most people agree that I did the right thing here and that we're steering it towards its completion in a way that's going to get us to the finish line successfully. And I also feel like by pulling the plug on migrating the worms was also the right thing to do. So here I am getting my nice clean hands filthy. So I'll take care of getting things cleaned up and put away after the camera stops rolling. But before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.